Since pretty much the early years of gaming, it was apparent that you could make a game whenever you wanted to as a developer. Sure, you had limitations and deadlines, but the ideas were endless. They could be fully original new IPs, or they could be based on something popular or obscure. So of course, most studios would try to make licensed games based on popular characters. We've had many attempts at adapting the feeling of playing as fan-favorite characters. However, it was always one genre that was fit for video games: superheroes. Since I was a kid, I have always had a soft spot for superhero video games, whether they were based on a comic or not. They're not just great games, but they're great simulations of those characters in the best possible way. At least, fundamentally. However, recently, superhero games have been on a bit of a downward spiral, ranging from solid games to whatever the hell Warner Brothers is doing right now. This is admittedly a great genre that suffers from so many current problems, and we'll acknowledge them today, starting from loosely talking about their history, the games themselves, and the future of this sub-genre. So of course, no video of mine is complete without a little bit of context. Superhero games are a funny thing to configure. On one hand, you have to make a game that evokes a power fantasy, but on the other, you must make a good challenging experience with great game design. The balance for these games has always been intrinsically hard for developers, but we've struck gold a few times. Things really started going for this subgenre during the rise of the PlayStation and Nintendo 64. With these new consoles came new 3D visuals that weren't just there to look cool, but to add a brand new dimension to gameplay. Things that could never be uniquely done in 2D could now actually stand out with the advent of 3D technology. This allowed for more complex games, not just in terms of technology that they ran on, but in terms of potential mechanics too. Games like PS1 Spider-Man could have proper voice acting, three-dimensional web swinging, along with combat designed for 3D. However, not all these games were winners like that one. A lot of superhero games suffered from being like other licensed games: rushed and bad. Not all was horrible, but for every Spider-Man 2000, we'd get a Batman Dark Tomorrow or something. It wasn't until 2004's Spider-Man 2 movie game that the potential for a good superhero game was somewhat fully realized. That game took almost every possible thing that you could do with Spider-Man at that time and made it into a fairly fun open-world action game. It was revolutionary for this genre and inspired other devs to take a crack at that sort of game. However, most games that weren't Spider-Man were pretty overlooked. There were gems like Hulk Ultimate Destruction and the X-Men Origins Wolverine game, but most superhero games were still not living up to that gold standard, at least in this point in the timeline. In 2009, Warner Brothers Interactive, Eidos Montreal, and Rocksteady Studios released Batman Arkham Asylum. This game had been in development for years, since Rocksteady hadn't really made a game in this genre, but wanted to make the player feel like Batman. They curated their own new combat system that hadn't been done before, or at least not in this way. The combat was free flow and based more on the rhythm of your attacks than just the attacks itself. Outside of creating a few new mechanics for combat and stealth, Rocksteady went all out making their attacks feel crunchy and powerful, really fulfilling the power fantasy while still supplying it with enough mechanical depth to be engaging. Then they made the sequel, Arkham City. This one was shaping to be bigger, better, braver, and bolder. It came out and was known as a great sequel to an already solid game. All it needed to do was improve on the parts where it went wrong, while keeping what worked intact, but it didn't do just that. It went above and beyond to fix Asylum's mechanical shortcomings, even if you could argue that the mechanics were perfect enough. There were problems with Asylum, like its stealth being good but simplistic, the free flow combat having slight bits of jankiness, or boss fights being admittedly pretty bad. City improved literally all of these fundamental aspects, along with adding new things like an open world. Before that was done to them, the series would go on with just 2 more games. Sure, they were controversial, but they're looked back on fondly enough and objectively did expand on the gameplay of the previous 2 games. Despite their controversial elements, even in gameplay, they did max out the potential for Batman combat and stealth in a video game. These games were revolutionary and influential. Literally almost every major action game tried copying this formula, but especially licensed games have tried. Spider-Man had attempted to emulate some of its success with the stealth in Shattered Dimensions, and the general combat of the Amazing Spider-Man movie games. Even games like Middle-earth and Mad Max had its style of combat. However, by the mid-2010s, the formula started to grow tired. And now we're in the age where superhero games are trying to be a bit more of their own thing, for better and worse. Which now leads us to the post-Activision/Marvel games era we've been living in since 2016. The whole Arkham free-flow trend was pretty much dying, and we had a fresh start with upcoming games like Marvel's Spider-Man and the Avengers. The games were looked at with the utmost hype and anticipation. In 2018, Spider-Man came out to nearly unanimous praise. Many, me included, were willing to call the game one of, if not the best interpretation of Spider-Man outside of comics. It had a great story, fun combat and swinging, that a lot of people could get into, many hailing it as the best Spider-Man simulation of all time, even with numerous things to complain about like MJ missions and puzzles. However, the real thing that pushed superhero games into the current weird state that we're in is games like Avengers. No matter how you feel about Avengers release, it seems to have impacted more of the conversation around modern comic book based games. I unfortunately can't quite quickly review it like the other games on this list because I don't have my own footage of it, along with it being delisted, but I still can say the game was very bad. It was a live service looter RPG with microtransactions for useless cosmetics and a boring gameplay loop. Just keep this part in mind as we go deeper into some of these games and the conversation surrounding most of them. However, this live service gameplay loop made things tedious and majorly unsatisfying, but at least the actual gameplay was good even if the loop wasn't, right? No. The combat was simplistic and mashy, but it wasn't mashy in the way where you still felt strong and felt like the characters and it was satisfying. All of your attacks felt like you were waving plastic baseball bats and toy boxing gloves at them. I never felt like Iron Man, Thor, Captain America, Hulk, or Black Widow. I just felt like I was cosplaying as them, like it was just polygons and code with an Avengers skin on top of it. There's so much I could try to say about it, like how the designs are awful or how generic the story is, but the whole point is that the game was very rough. I feel like the bad taste of Avengers made a lot of people skeptical over new superhero games, especially games we knew weren't just going to be single-player ventures. It seems like since the failure of Avengers, a lot of people have become more skeptical of superhero games, so we'll pretty much cover every major superhero game released after Avengers. Also after Miles Morales, because I don't feel like reviewing that game again.
So he's an idiot.
So we're actually starting off with a good game, which is kind of gonna screw with the point of this video. Oh wait, shit, this game was a flop. Yeah, it's no coincidence that the failure of Avengers completely fucked over the launch of this game, and made it so that no one wanted it. I would say I was guilty of this too, as I'd never played it until it came to Game Pass and PS Plus in 2022. After I played it, I actually really liked the game, but I wouldn't necessarily say I loved it. As far as campaign goes, it's probably one of my favorite modern superhero game narratives, which says more than you would think. All of the characters have so much personality and bounce off of each other well enough, the arcs are great, and the Guardians' formation as a found family is compelling. I especially appreciate how it doesn't just take from the MCU stories either. There are many characters, Easter eggs, and plot points from the more obscure comics, which I find more refreshing than copying MCU or James Gunn verbatim. There is influence from the Marvel Cinematic Universe, but it's more in character designs and general comedic tone than the actual plot and characters. I especially like how you can make different choices that affect the outcome of gameplay. I'm aware that choices in games aren't a new thing, but instead of drastically changing your ending to the bad one, you instead get ways to make the game easier or add tools to your arsenal. It sounds like something to make the game less fun, but it actually makes the game more fun. Something I loved about the story is that, like the MCU's version of the Guardians of the Galaxy, it really humanizes this team. They don't just need to consist of fun comedic chops and banter, they feel like real three-dimensional characters. Groot is the exception because he's mostly there for comedic relief, but the game is already balancing the main arcs of Star-Lord, Gamora, and Drax, so it's fine that there wasn't much to him there. The only character you could technically say had the least going on was Rocket. It's mainly because his flaws aren't as dramatized, nor are they as emotionally impactful, but at the same time, his arc serves the game well enough. Him starting off as a closed-off, childish narcissist, slowly becoming more and more open and caring about the team, is a pretty fun arc. And in anything else, he would have probably never changed, or the characters would think him being an asshole throughout the entire game was excusable, but no, Rocket actually learns to be more selfless. The themes of loss and moving on are especially compelling with this cast of characters. I especially like that the main villain is a religious nut that promises a mind prison disguised as personal paradise, where the characters would have to be pulled out and move on. Instead of it being a stupid brainwashing trope, the characters at first feel like they genuinely should stay in that mind prison. Yes, Star-Lord and others may convince themselves to move on eventually, but that's more understandable than having a villain brainwash the main characters and then have all their work undone because the test subject got nostalgic. The promise and its impact on the characters actually makes a lot of sense. I especially love the scene where Drax had to literally kill his grief to move on. The game's story is likable and nice to experience, but my problem is that it's supported by fairly simple gameplay. The gameplay ideas here are pretty solid for the most part. You're able to control only Star-Lord, but you can indirectly control the other 4 members by doing team callouts. It's a lot like Final Fantasy XV's callouts, where you can call on other party members to assist of some sort. My big problem with its gameplay is that it presents all these cool ideas that could work in a Guardians of the Galaxy game, but it ultimately doesn't flesh them out. A lot of the time, you're just going to be running laterally while holding the right trigger until the cooldown. They do try to shake it up with the elemental ammunition, but it's ultimately hollow when it's used to just just simplistically tear down an enemy's shield. Simplicity isn't a bad thing, but this feels a step too far into being brain dead. It doesn't help that the Guardians' callouts don't feel that strategic. They often exist to spam over and over again while you mindlessly strafe and shoot. The combat can definitely be fun at times, but it's often stagnant and dull. Boss fights are especially hit or miss too. I do like the Raker battle and the Fin Fang Foom one, but the final boss is without a shadow of a doubt the worst. Mainly because it's not even a boss, it's just a horde of normal enemies with the Magus being a Smash Bros stage hazard. It's like the icon of sin if it was lethally boring. What sucks is that it sort of ruins the conclusion by feeling unneeded, but at the same time, the Magus plot was completely unresolved. So they decided to just force a postscript climax of sorts at the end. Not technically a bad idea, but I felt like the Raker fight was fairly conclusive enough to end the game a lot better than the Magus one did. If anything, Magus could have been a really cool third phase that teamed up with Raker in the fight or something. Sadly, the fight was already too mechanically complex, at least for this game, so it makes sense as to why that wasn't the case, and instead we just got a horde mode of enemies with a few scripted moments. As far as positives go, I think the boss arena is visually the coolest in the whole game. I also think that the little dialogue options are fairly funny too. I just wish the boss fight in itself was better, or just simply not included. There are other boss fights, like the one with spaceship combat that's pretty decent. I'm not usually a big fan of spaceship combat in most games, but if it doesn't last too long, then I'm fine with it. And it doesn't last too long here, so I don't mind it as much. It's at least a fairly decent shakeup from the ground-strafing standard combat. There's also the Dweller in Darkness fight, which was actually one of the fairly good fights in this game. It has a tanky health bar, but there are ways to circumvent this. One is using rockets bombs in the arena, which do the most damage. The other is triggering certain quicktime events that basically lessen the time you spend fighting. As far as real bosses go, this is actually pretty decent showing from the game. Next one I'm a bit more mixed on, and that's the fight with the Blood Brothers. I definitely think the idea of keeping them separate to damage them is pretty novel, but there's a giant problem. The problem is that the fight becomes more and more scripted as more players drop in. As great as the mechanic of keeping the brothers separated was, it was hard to tell how much you as the player are actually doing versus what the game is doing. The reason for this is because you don't exactly take out their health bars all the way, and you're pretty much playing against the clock more than the actual boss. It's a bit disappointing because it is one of the better bosses in this game, but it felt like it could have been more. Maybe they could have had a way to split the aggression between the Guardians and stuff, I don't know. I think a big problem with this game is also that there are a bunch of technical issues too. Less so on current gen and more so on last gen, but they still rear their head a bit sometimes. It's mainly in terms of frame rate more than bugs and glitches though. On PS5 and Series X, the 60 FPS mode is somewhat stable for the first half of the game. When you get to the second half of the game though, the frame rate often goes more into the early 40s and the low 50s. I'm aware that some people won't notice this sort of thing, but it's still a bit bothersome that the game has numerous performance issues, which I'm sure a future console's backwards compatibility will fix, probably, but it's still uncertain territory right now. I am ragging on the game quite a lot, I admit, but I do like the game still. I just personally feel like not enough people talk about the flaws with its gameplay as much as they should. Believe me, it's a great story with decent gameplay, but unfortunately it couldn't have the financial performance it frankly deserved because of Avengers sabotaging its chances. It's a game that you can clearly tell had a lot of passion going into it, but the Avengers' bad reception overshadowed how much of a solid game this truly is. The story and characters are fantastic, the levels are designed well enough, and the dynamic of the team makes the slower moments easier to get through. For every good story moment though, the gameplay could be rudimentary and standard, even if it can be fun at times. No matter what though, the game definitely deserved way better.
I brought back some takeout, so let's get down and pig out.
I swear I'll get into things that I'll criticize more eventually. Just let me have this moment to praise Shredder's Revenge, okay? This game is another game that is good, and surprisingly doesn't suffer the same as most of the other superhero games on this list. It's only really here because 1, I need to cover every major superhero game, and 2, I need something positive. It can't all just be doom and gloom. Anyway, this game is a pretty fun, light, retro revival action beat 'em up. Shredder's Revenge is probably one of my favorite action games I played in several years. What I love is that it's a great modern interpretation of the old TMNT beat-em-ups without sacrificing what made those games fun. I'm glad it's not just a nostalgic cash-in meant to capitalize on people's childhoods. Yes, it technically is that, since it was also released when Rise of the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles movie was coming out for Netflix, but it's still a game with passion. Almost every aspect of the game spells out pure, unadulterated fun. Back when it was announced, I had assumed it'd be something like a barely evolved Turtles in Time, but I'm glad I was wrong. When I gave the game a shot, went in 2022, I had probably some of the most fun I had playing any game that year. It's nostalgic, but it's also a sincerely nostalgic game that's not afraid to try anything new to improve on the TMNT beat-em-up formula. This game's combat is amazing, as far as modern beat-em-ups go at least. This might be my favorite modern beat-em-up / retro revival combat system since maybe Streets of Rage 4? You can do real combos outside of mashing basic attack buttons and doing a special move. I appreciate the enemy variety too, especially as the game goes on. Hilariously, this 3 to 4 hour game has more enemy variety than a lot of mass-produced 20 to 30 hour AAA third-person action games that come out nowadays. It makes sense why, mainly because the variety of bosses need to have more lackeys, so of course you can't just have the same foot soldiers there the whole game. Boss fights are also fun, but they do have one tiny issue that's still fairly egregious until later missions. They do that thing where they summon a bunch of normal enemies, which can get really annoying. The bosses are cheesable enough for it to be not too bad, but it does get incredibly agitating and leaves deaths pretty unfair if you actually die. I appreciate the latter few bosses with Chrome Dome, Krang, and Shredder to be the best of the fights, mainly because they either show how to integrate normal enemies into the fight, or because they don't spawn normal enemies like crazy. Like how with Chrome Dome, you can use the enemies to hit his cannon, or how you can throw normal enemies at the Statue of Tyranny boss fight. Every other fight does this thing where it starts off really good until they start summoning normal enemies. It also doesn't help that I didn't play with other people, and I did so for fun after I finished the game. The boss fights are really cool, and I love how pretty varied their movesets are, but I do think that the overuse of normal enemies does get in the way. Besides the Chrome Dome fight or the Statue of Tyranny boss fight, they don't really add anything. They just seem to exist to overwhelm you with numbers instead of letting the boss challenge you instead. It's probably because the bosses on their own aren't exactly all that hard, but it is just what it is. I don't dislike any of the bosses, but I do think that the normal enemies do spoil what could have been pretty special moments. At least they got Shredder and Krang right, I guess. Slight problem with boss fights aside, I think the game is still really fun. It also has a pretty vibrant color palette and great art direction that respects its classic roots instead of sacrificing them for something more bog standard and cynical. The character models are incredibly expressive too. There's not really much to say about this game in the grand scheme of superhero games overall, but I may as well include it here because I would have complained if I didn't.
My name's Richard Grayson, but all the kids at the orphanage call me Dick.
Well, children can be cruel.
For some reason, I initially forgot to put this game in the script, but I have honestly not that much new to say about this game. The game's awful, but it honestly could be so much worse, and we'll get to that later. For now, we can talk about how painful of an experience Gotham Knights is. One thing I personally liked about the game was its concept. Batman dying and passing the torch on the younger Bat family members is a cool concept. I like how Batman dies in a sensible, respectable way that isn't stupid, which is a weird thing to praise, but I swear, we'll get to that later. I also like how his death looms over other characters. I think trying to adapt the Court of Owls is also a really cool idea, but they don't really do much with them. I think they could have been some of the best villains in the game, but as far as villains in this game go, they're pretty lame. Jesus, Talia, what the hell happened to you? Also, Bruce coming back for a boss fight was insanely predictable. It's not predictable in the way where the fight happens, and it's the best it could be either. The main problem with Bruce coming back is that it's left unsatisfying, and the way it's dealt with is trite and cliche. Like in all media with a character getting brainwashed, the main characters have to ask him to remember the good old days. Ultimately, in both gameplay and narrative significance, the entire fight is left completely derailed and unfulfilling. The story in itself is okay at best, but there was a lot of potential to have a great Bat Family story in here. Unfortunately, the story is massively boring, with only a few bright spots, like the character interactions being pretty decent. Otherwise, the story is generic and dull, and overall, with very little of note, and a lack of good development for the main characters. Story aside, this game's gameplay is a massive downgrade from the Arkham series. I'm aware that the point of the game is not to be another Arkham game, but that doesn't keep the gameplay from being a giant step down in quality. It's a good thing that the game wanted to be unique and not take Arkham's free-flow combat, but what it was replaced with was less novel and more generic. Every combo feels unsatisfying to pull off because the combat has no flow. I don't think it needed to just be Arkham again, but it needed to feel a bit smoother than this. Your moves feel stiff and slow. The combat overall lacks the fast pace of not just the Arkham games, but superhero games in general. The next game I'm mentioning, Marvel's Midnight Suns, has more fast-paced combat than Gotham Knights, and that's a turn-based card game. You have a light attack and a heavy attack like in Avengers, and it's just as button mashy. Each character has unique attributes, but unfortunately they all suck to play as. This is a multiplayer game too, but I played by myself because no one I know actually wanted to play this with me. There are also boss fights in this game, and they absolutely suck. They're tanky damage sponges, and they don't really feel unique, or even just simply fun to fight. It may sound like a skill issue sort of thing, but hilariously, the best fights of the game are the ones that have less health. Not because they're easy and I'm lazy, but because they are the least monotonous bosses in the whole game. They then have the problem of being so easy that it feels underwhelming. So it's basically a lose-lose scenario. You definitely can't use the "it's not Arkham" excuse when defending the boss quality. Sure, it's not Arkham, but WB Montreal, the developers of this game, also developed Arkham Origins, which had some of the best fights in the entire series. Now, Origins may also have a Mr. Freeze fight that kinda sucks, but every other major boss was pretty good for the most part. Deathstroke was cool, Bane was genuinely tense, Killer Croc was a cool starter fight. Origins had so many cool boss fights that were challenging and fun. I think even people that still pretend to hate Origins can admit that the Deathstroke boss fight was still really cool and rewarding. No boss fight in Gotham Knights will ever come as close to even the bottom of Origins as far as boss quality. If we're even going to compare it to the Arkham series and rank its bosses, I'd say it's somewhere above the stupid tank fights in Arkham Knight, Titan Joker, and Arkham City Deadshot. The best bosses are just the ones that look the coolest, and I put that in giant quotes. But they aren't the ones that are the most mechanically fun, because none of them are. Fuck all of the bosses in this game. Of course, combat isn't the only thing that sucks in this game, because there's an open world that you can traverse. The open world sucks, by the way. Traversal in this game is absolutely horrendous. Basic walking and running is tanky as all hell, which even the Arkham games felt slightly less so. But when you get into a vehicle or use any aerial traversal, that's when everything starts to feel boring. Your movement is basically slow to a crawl, along with the fact that it's janky as shit. When you use a vehicle, it's incredibly sluggish to get around. The game will try to give you the illusion of speed with all these garish white speed lines, but it still feels slow. This feels like riding Nimbus in Dragon Ball Z Kakarot or something. You also have aerial traversal, which is honestly hilarious. Whether you're gliding as Batgirl, fart jumping as Jason Todd, or Fortnite gliding as Nightwing, it's pretty damn boring. Jason Todd's movement is actually the funniest thing that this game tries to explain. He apparently gained it from the Lazarus Pit's energy or something, which is such a dumb way to explain a dumb mechanic. He should have honestly just done parkour or something, which would have been cooler. There's also progression that shows that it was originally going to be a live service game similar to Avengers, but they seem to double back on it. I wonder why. Honestly, that's a good thing, because of the fact that Avengers was such a massive misfire, and live service games like this often don't do well. However, Gotham Knights didn't do too well either financially. With all that said, Gotham Knights is a game that, at its very best, is pretty mediocre. It's not the worst game of all time, it's not even the worst superhero game of all time, but I'd still say it's pretty bad. The story isn't great, but it's not horrible either, I guess. I think it could have totally worked as a continuation of the Arkham series versus that other game we'll get to later. Unfortunately, the gameplay is a ginormous downgrade from its predecessor, and there's no special mechanics that can save it from being boring.
It's time to
Okay, this game actually surprised me when I first played it this year. For about 3 years, I heavily joked with my friends about how this game had a bunch of hype CGI trailers, but is also a card-focused turn-based RPG. For that, I basically judged it for being its own thing, because I was so used to big-budget console superhero games being fast-paced, third-person action games. However, I played about 4 hours of this on PS Plus, and I actually like what I've played so far. Something I appreciate about this game is how it actually is geared towards comic fans more than MCU fans. It's not a superiority thing, but I often find a lot of recent Marvel stuff outside of movies often pandering to the MCU or whatever recent cinematic or televised appearances. Midnight Suns doesn't fillet MCU memorabilia since it's more focused on the greater Marvel universe than just the stuff the MCU covered. The fan service is especially appreciated though. It's not nostalgia baiting and key jangling. It's rather tasteful and insightful compared to most things. A lot of it comes from asking other characters about their backstories and why they do what they do. And it feels like it appeals to comic fans, but also allows casual fans who just watch the movies to understand things. Fan service and fun lore aside, the game has great gameplay. Initially, it was weird to play an XCOM style Marvel game with card mechanics, but I got used to it eventually. It actually gets really fun and I genuinely had to think about my placement and my moves instead of just spamming through the fights. So far, I've only gotten through one boss and it was fine. The best way I could describe the boss was that it was definitely a tanky turn-based boss. I can't really say anything about bosses since I haven't played outside of one in the first hour of the game. The story so far is also fine for what is in the first few hours. It's a bit slow, but this is an RPG that's apparently like 25 to 40 hours long, so whenever I'm done with the campaign, I'll probably make a video on it. The game basically follows you playing as the Hunter, the OC child of Lilith, and trying to stop her from summoning demons upon this version of the Marvel Universe. So far, a pretty simple plot, but from what I'm guessing, you're gonna meet a lot more Marvel characters. Speaking of which, you can form relationships with them and hang out and such. Consider this Marvel's Persona without the school shit. It's fun to talk to these characters as, again, you'll learn unique lore about the Marvel characters and your own character. Not too much else to say about Midnight Suns outside of the fact that it is a good game. I haven't gotten too far, but when I finish the campaign, I expect a video on it at some point. I'm hoping that it gets even better as I go along. All I gotta say is, sorry I doubted you guys. I didn't recognize your game.
I definitely don't want to miss out on 19 inches of Venom. You know?
Oh boy, so first things first, I take back what I said in my game ranking. Okay, Spider-Man 2 is still definitely in my top 5 for games of 2023, and was the most fun I had playing a game for the first time in that year. However, I only really put it as Game of the Year because of my recency bias, and that's what made me do so. It didn't seem right to put it any lower, even though I knew it had multiple problems, specifically narratively. Another reason I put it at number 1 was partially because I was scared of Spider-Man fans, and the fact that they would get snippy if I put it any lower, even at number 2. I'm aware that my channel is irrelevant, but Spider-Man fans always find a way. If I were able to change the ranking, I'd probably put it at number 4 with Dead Space, Final Fantasy 16, and Hi-Fi Rush remaining in the top 3. The other 24 games can stay where they are in terms of ranking, honestly. Anyway, Spider-Man 2 is a game with really high highs in terms of its qualities. Unfortunately, it's not a perfect sequel, let alone a perfect game. I won't be like some people and say that it's horrible in any way, but there are definitely obvious and obnoxious problems that I did address in my own review, but I'll gladly expand on them here. Consider this an addendum to my original review. I don't think mentioning the story and its numerous problems really breaks new grounds, but I often find myself disliking the story more and more as I think about it. I won't even call it a bad story, but I take back calling it solid. It does not hold up under scrutiny. However, I'd cease to call the story bad or miserable. I still think the characters are likable, and while I've heard critiques about Peter and Harry's friendship, I still find it compelling. I love the fact that their entire relationship is an amazing showcase of male bonding in media that we don't see that much. The banter between Harry and Peter is probably my favorite part of any of these characters because they really just feel like friends. Unfortunately, their relationship is so well written that I can't really buy that Harry could be a villain at all. He doesn't seem to have a good reason to become Venom. We'll get to that later though, so let's talk about other parts of the story that kinda suck. Despite the story not being bad, I still think the pacing is pretty bad in this game from beginning to end. The game starts off well with a cool spectacle fight with Sandman, but for the next 3 hours or so, it sort of goes into a slowdown phase. I won't be like some people who say this makes it a walking simulator. I already reviewed Walking Simulator on my channel before, but it definitely isn't fun to replay. They're not too bad, but they were plentiful for the first few hours of the game, and to an extent that was a bit obnoxious. Then once you get to the symbiote part, the game is in a giant rush to get through everything. This is where the pacing honestly jumps off a cliff, since there's so much to cover, but at the same time, this isn't supposed to be a long game. Unfortunately, the 10 to 15 hour long experience is too much and has too much shit to fit in its story. You have Peter being taken over by the symbiote, Dr. Connors needs to be cured of being Lizard again, Kraven looking for targets, Harry's sick and needs the suit back, Miles is eventually hunting Mr. Negative. Oh yeah, right, Miles is also here, I guess. What sucks so much about Miles' subplot is that it's honestly really good. In fact, it's way better written than the main plot. The big problem comes in when you realize that Miles is barely relevant to the main plot for the most part. I've heard some people say that he's Peter's woke and diverse replacement that they really wanted to maximize screen time for, but he's not even that. Miles is barely even in this game at all, so I have no idea why people even want to pretend like he's some woke character there to replace Peter. If anything, Peter gets way more screen time and way more focused and is far more dignified than Miles. Obviously, it's Peter's story and it should be treated as such, but at the same time, Miles is the secondary character on the box art, so he should be treated just as much as an equal and not completely shafted like he is in this game. I'm okay with Miles having his own plot, but it feels completely disconnected from the main story up until the third act. He just sort of appears whenever Peter needs help, but he's barely in the game. I'm aware that this is Peter's series, but at the same time, if Miles is the second main character, he should be treated as such. He's a second main character, not a secondary character. There's a difference. Anyway, the main plot is actually fine when you don't consider how rushed it is. I think the Black Suit arc is handled really well in this game, in isolation at least. The idea that it's tied to the other Spider-Man and a relatively loose adaptation of Kraven's Last Hunt is such a cool idea, but the story doesn't want to give itself time to breathe, which ultimately hurts the narrative so much more. Peter with the symbiote acts like he should, and it's done really well. The issues come in when you realize that his descent into madness is skimmed through in a way that makes it feel like he just gets angry and shifts his mood out of nowhere. His dialogue is as fantastic as it can be, especially in the fights with Blizzard, Kraven, and the fight where you play as Miles to stop Peter. The problem is that there's not enough in between to make it feel like a smooth transition. Once the symbiote arc is over though, it gets even worse. I will go on record and die on the hill that the third act of the game is great from a gameplay perspective, but goes too off the rails from a narrative standpoint. Everything at this point unfortunately takes a bit of a nosedive. Once Venom is introduced, you realize he's pretty generic as far as motives go. I'm sure we know how layered Eddie Brock was in the comics. In another video where I talk about the Sony Venomverse movies, I even mention how his hatred for Spider-Man and Peter Parker makes him who he is. The problem with this Venom isn't just that it's not Eddie, but it's that the game doesn't do anything fresh or cool enough to make it any better. This version of Harry being Venom doesn't really make a lot of sense logically. Him and Peter are the best of friends, and Harry only really gets snippy with Peter when he has the black suit and can't really control the words out of his mouth. My problem isn't that it's not like the comics, or that it's different. It's that Harry and Peter's relationship is too good to break. Obviously, when the best friend and the main character is an antagonist, there are believable ways to make them turn evil. Spider-Man 2 doesn't really do that at all. The problem with making this version of Harry Venom and not Eddie Brock is the fact that the writers can't find a logical breaking point between Peter and Venom's host without going overboard and making them do something too ridiculous. The problem with this interpretation is that Harry and Peter are too kind to each other, and you'd have to make something really impactful happen to break their friendship. This also leads to the fact that Harry isn't really the villain, and Venom, the symbiote, is the main force controlling him, which makes it less interesting. It's not like the symbiote's motives are very interesting or even comprehensible. It's not FF7 Rebirth Sephiroth levels of confusion, but it definitely doesn't make sense as to why the symbiote really wants the alien invasion. He basically just wants to cover the world in black tendrils, which is boring. Forget having an interesting rivalry with Spider-Man or feeling abandoned after Peter ditched him. He instead wants to become God King of the symbiotes. They try to tie it into the heal the world thing, but it ultimately rings a bit hollow when you realize that Venom is a completely separate entity from Harry to the point where Harry is just the unwilling host. He may talk like his host, he may even verbalize his thoughts, but Harry isn't driving any of it. It really sucks because I really cared for the characters in the climax. For as bland as this version of Venom was, I still liked Harry and didn't want him to die. Now let's just hope that, in terms of villains, they actually save their best for last, because Venom was kind of a giant miss in this game. Outside of the story, the game is still fantastic on most other fronts. I already talked about how good the swinging in combat and the side missions were in my own review, but there are things that I could have expanded upon and honestly should have. A lot of my story critiques were pretty thorough, but I rushed the gameplay bit to my original review. A major thing I wish I could have expanded upon more were boss fights, which I genuinely liked in this game. Each one is mechanically interesting for the most part, and in terms of story significance are absolutely perfect, even if the story is a bit weak. The ones in the main story feel like big events with high stakes. All of them are actually harder than the last two games, especially on the first playthrough. Their approach compared to the last game is different. It's less on patterns and more hit them until they die. Now usually this is pretty boring, unless you add interesting mechanics and moves. Thankfully, most bosses have decent enough moveset variety to offset this problem. My personal favorite fights in this game as far as narrative and gameplay go are the Kraven fight and the Peter fight. I think the Kraven one is probably the most unique of the bosses, as he uses its hunting techniques for the majority of his moveset. His first phase is like most of the other fights, but then phase 2 is more inventive and fun. Now he uses a bell to weaken the symbiote, his stealth is enhanced, and he perches on a tree to snipe at you sometimes too. He honestly is the most underrated fight in the game. Then you have the Miles vs. Peter fight, which was really good. My only problem is that it has narrative issues caused by the lack of general build-up for some theme, but it's overall still a great fight. My favorite part of the fight is that through each phase, Peter gets another one of his moves that you had already been using throughout the whole game. I especially like that you can use the bell against Peter like how Kraven did, but you're the one in control. I would say that the Kraven fight was better, but the sheer hype of this one is unmatched in comparison. The bosses overall are great, but of course there are some minor problems that I hope get fixed by game number 3. I personally think that these fights are mostly better than the original 2 games, but they do have that one tiny annoyance, and that is that they're mainly just standard fights. This sounds stupid, but let me explain. While the pattern repeating in the first game was a bit monotonous, the boss fights felt a bit more unique for it. I still think of how creative the Electro and Vulture gang fights mechanics were, even if it was a little easy. In Spider-Man 2, there aren't fights that are as unique, and they often take place in these incredibly small closed-off arenas. Another part that's more of a double-edged sword is that these fights are long. The problem isn't precisely that they're long. I mean, I am someone who personally dips my toes into JRPGs, specifically Final Fantasy and Persona. I've played longer boss fights and enjoyed them. However, other games justified the length of their bosses a little bit more than Spider-Man 2 for a couple of reasons. One reason is that other games have more moveset variety for the bosses. I did say that the fights in Spider-Man 2 did have variety, but I don't think they have enough to justify their length, which can at times go up to 15 minutes assuming you don't die multiple times. I still think they're fun, but they at times may last a phase too long, which is caused by the next issue. The other issue that pertains as to why fights are so long is that the phases are separated by health bars, instead of just being single big health bars in chunks. In a few games, the health bar phase tactic works, like in Doom Eternal, but in Doom Eternal, the health bars aren't as tanky. You see, in video games, the feeling of variety has to be kept with brevity, unless it's a boss fight that has literally so much to show that it has to take 15 to 20 minutes. Spider-Man 2 does it fine a lot of the times, but in some fights, that problem really starts to creep in. I think the boss fights that showcase this problem the most are the Mr. Negative fight and especially the Scream fight. In the case of Mr. Negative, he's a phase too long and he probably has the smallest pool of moves of the entire boss roster. In phase 1, he starts simple with vertical and horizontal slashes, a jab, another projectile, and he has an unblockable. Then phase 2 starts where he summons this negative energy Susanoo thing and throws tornadoes along with the vertical and horizontal slashes, which was novel at first. When we get to the rest of phase 2 is when his moveset feels more limited. His jab does evolve into a 3-piece combo, but that's about it. His unblockable also evolves into a 3-piece combo, which is fine, but I expected a bit better from the second phase. Then he does the negative Susanoo thing again, which repeats the same thing, and once you break that, you literally get the exact same fight as phase 2. It's a fun fight in isolation, but it ultimately is repetitive. It's not even that bad of a fight, but it's just repetitious and needlessly drawn out. Scream fares better, but it's still one of the game's weaker offerings. I appreciate that most of her moveset involves her hair in some way, which is neat. My big issue with the fight is that it's 4 phases long, and nothing really changes until the last phase. I feel like if this boss was just 2 phases, it would have honestly been one of the top 5 fights in the game, but it unfortunately lasted way too long, which is a shame because Scream looks badass in this game and has fun moves to learn on paper. As for other main campaign fights, they're still good. Side mission bosses aren't too much to write home about, but I think they're fun too. I like the Mysterio one because of the visuals, even if I felt the combat was a bit lacking, but it was still fun. The Wraith fight is like a weaker version of the Kraven fight, but it's still pretty fun and challenging. The Flame side mission, by the way, is also my favorite side mission chain in the entire game anyway. The Lizard fight and Chase were enthralling and fun in the main campaign. Lizard may not have had the best moves, but he was still fun to wail on and knocked me on my ass a couple of times, especially in phase 3 where his health bar is tankier and he does more damage. Although, like Scream and Lee, I feel like he could have had one phase taken out, but it's not nearly as egregious for me to care. The chase in between was fun too, and it has spectacle that feels earned since it's tied to a mechanically sound boss fight. I actually like the final Venom fight, which I see as the most overhyped yet underrated part of the whole game. I liked Venom mechanically, but in terms of spectacle, he could have been so much more. I think my big issue is that 2 of his phases are largely wasted on individual Spider-Men. The reason this is bad is because it would have been better if we played one phase as Peter, one as Miles, then the final one with them together as a team, especially since the tagline for this game was, "Be greater together." This fight is one of the best in the game, with some of the most variety, save for Kraven, but circumstantially it shoots itself in the foot by not having Peter and Miles work together outside of a single QuickTime event. What makes things worse is the fact that the marketing made it seem like their arena was going to be much better, but No. I think the school for the first two phases was fine enough thematically, but then the final phase takes place in some building we saw earlier, but we don't feel attached to it, especially when we play as Miles, who has never stepped into this building until now, which is a bit lame. The fight is still challenging, especially with the winged venom allowing for aerial combat, but the setting is still boring. Such a conflicting final fight that's mechanically good, but at the same time underwhelming. I would say overall, Spider-Man 2 is still a great game that I gave too much credit in my game ranking. A lot of that was due to recency bias and the fear of Spider-Man fans, but I still think that the game is damn good despite its numerous flaws. It's a game with pretty low lows in its story, but in terms of gameplay and spectacle, it's the highest highs of the series.
Rip and tear until it is done.
So I actually tried the first 2 or 3 hours of this game, and I think it's competent. I mentioned in my Hellboy 2 video, but I don't think that it's a great game, yet I still see its value. Web of Wyrd is a game that honestly has a lot of qualities that could make it bad, but a lot of it is executed pretty well. The most obvious note of praise is the art direction and visuals. I think this game and Hi-Fi Rush are honestly one of the best looking cel-shaded games in recent times. The stylization, making it look like one of Mike Mignola's classic books, is amazing, and I especially love the shading. My only real problem with the visuals is that in cutscenes, where it tries to look comic booky, it lacks energy. I would get it if the characters were more expressive or if there was onomatopoeia on the screen more often, but there isn't, and it leaves the cutscenes looking a bit dry and dull. The characters just stood around and I couldn't really tell if they were moving or not. It was weird. That aside, there's other stuff to praise and critique about this game. The gameplay is honestly not very deep at all. In fact, it's quite shallow in its formula. This game is a roguelike, which I actually think works for a character like Hellboy. The combat isn't complex, but it does a good job at making you feel strong at the very least. I like how your punches are heavy and simple to execute, but you still feel strong. Your speed isn't high, but it's only because they buffed your strength. Again, combat isn't deep, but it feels good enough for me to not mind all too much. There really isn't much to say about combat otherwise. The problems come in when you realize that the game is a roguelike, but it's not that challenging at the same time. I don't think difficulty equals a good or fun game at all, but I do think that this game could have used way more challenge. It doesn't need to be ball-blisteringly difficult, but it needs just a little bit more to make it kind of a challenge. Since this is a roguelike, it's a little disappointing that the difficulty is pretty lacking. I've heard some defended by saying it's a roguelite and not a roguelike, which first off is untrue, and second, I've played roguelites that are way more difficult than Web of Wyrd. It's okay to admit that the game that you like isn't hard, and I mean it. I mean, a lot of games I like aren't that hard sometimes. A game doesn't have to be hard to be good, but as far as this genre goes, it's pretty important. Roguelikes are known for their difficulty because they're games where if you make one wrong mistake in your run, you have to start all over from the beginning of your run while the story still technically continues. This game doesn't really keep me on my toes or afraid of dying or anything. It's more like something that's just a bit inconvenient. Boss fights are also another aspect of this game that suffers. The main problem is that they're normal enemies, but the only difference is that they have way more health and do just barely more damage than most normal enemies. As far as boss fights go, they're pretty easy and they don't have the proper moveset variety, scale, or spectacle to be all that engaging. It may sound like I don't like this game, but I don't really think it's bad. Hell, I don't even think it's a mediocre game. I'd even go as far to say it's pretty good, but it feels too simplistic to give a higher rating. Hellboy Web of Wyrd is a very competent stylized action game, but it's not anything special. At least we're doing better than Rock Bottom.
What, we some kind of Suicide Squad?
So, here we are at the finish line. This is the reason I wanted to make this video in the first place, and I honestly can't say too much new about this game that hasn't been already said by everyone who's experienced it. This game is fundamentally flawed from its concept alone. You want to know the crazy part though? I didn't even finish this game's main campaign yet. Yeah, I know, I'm a fraud, but hear me out. So, due to me not wanting to spend any money on this game, I decided to play the free trial on PS Plus Premium. Now ultimately, the premium trials are conceptually dumb since they may as well just put the full games on the service, considering that PS Plus Extra already exists. But I didn't want to play this game unless I got it through a subscription service. All I gotta say is, I want my 3 hours back. I only played 3 out of the 10 to 12 hours of this campaign via $18 subscription service, and I still feel ripped off. Let's just start with the good stuff first before hating. You gotta have something nice to say if you're not gonna give the game a 0 out of 10 or anything, right? First, there's no denying that the game looks really good as far as fidelity and aesthetics go. While it definitely isn't an art style that's for me, I don't dislike the art direction too much. I like that Metropolis is a well-designed world visually. It's not Liberty City or anything, but at least it looks nice. Second point of praise, some of the music is okay. A lot of it is whatever, but I think it fits the tone and works for this game. Final note of praise is that the gameplay is fun for the first hour or so. Figuring out the shooting and traversal is actually quite a decent time in the first hour and a half of the game. Okay, we're done with praise, so we can just get to hating now. This game's gameplay was fine for the first hour or so, but holy shit is it boring after that. It's not that the game's controls feel weird or how good the shooting feels, but it's how little variety there is. Once you've played the tutorial and gotten past the first few missions, that's what it seems like the whole game is. I haven't even finished the whole campaign, but I know that this is going to be the whole game. There are literally only a few enemies in the whole game from what I've heard from other people who finished the game. You have basic enemies you can use counter shot on, and vehicles. There's literally no variety outside of that. And I swear, in my inevitable video on this game, I will mention that shit. I know you've probably heard this too, but the UI in this game is bad. It's so cluttered, and all it does is fill the screen with nauseating nonsense over and over again. I've heard people say that it's fine because you can turn it off, but that's not an excuse. I'm supposed to have it on to display the game's most useful information, and if I don't have the game's most useful information, I can't play it the way it's intended. If you can't design a UI that can't be understood without being cluttered, you have failed at making a good user interface. The biggest problem with the game is probably the absolutely abhorrent storytelling and characters. I've only played the first 3 hours and already wanted them to shut the hell up by the 150th minute of this game. Every squad member makes a joke almost every few minutes, which is kinda like the Guardians of the Galaxy game, but the difference is that in that game, the dialogue was way better and the jokes were funny. The game also used its humor for more general character building other than just stereotyping its characters. I'm not kidding, each joke in this game basically goes in a similar format for each character. King Shark doesn't get sarcasm and is the most innocent. Please laugh. Captain Boomerang is an Australian and an annoying dick. Please laugh. Harley is an insanely loud and horny lesbian. Please laugh. The only one who doesn't have a joke stereotype is Deadshot, but that's because he's often used for a punchline or is the most serious one. So many parts of the first 3 hours of this game are absolutely dreadful. The gameplay becomes quickly boring, the characters are all really obnoxious, and I really will never understand why the hell this was tied to the Batman Arkham games of all things. Honestly, if you switched a few events around, Gotham Knights would have made for a better successor to Arkham Knight than whatever the hell this was. I won't even say any more about this game for now, because I want to put this in its own video. I will not, and absolutely will not, buy this game until it drops on PS Plus's extra catalog or something. I know it's a bold bet that it'll even manage to be on a subscription service, but considering this game's quickly dwindling numbers in both concurrent players and sales, it's very possible. Soon enough, this game will get the video it deserves from me. Editor's note, apparently it was free on Amazon for like 3 days and I got it. Yeah, this video took like a really long time to record and I wrote the script in like June or something. So, sorry for my incompetence, but if anything, it proves my point. Okay, see ya. Just like with my MCU video, I won't go and say that superhero things are dying or falling off, but their current state is a little bit concerning. There is still a fair amount of good content, but it's honestly become a severe case of a mixed bag. I'm aware that it's always been a mixed bag, but to be fair, in the 2000s to early 2010s, that was back when superhero games were contractually obligated rushed license games, and back when development time was way shorter than it is now. Back when games like the X-Men Origins Wolverine game came out, most quality and polished video games took about 1 to 2 years to make. Nowadays, when we still haven't heard anything about the new Wolverine game from Insomniac, video games take over 4 years to make. The problem with these games is that it's more obvious and concerning when there's more time given to make them, and when the releases are way more spread out. So now I answered the main question of this video. What the hell is going on with superhero games? Why are they more obviously so all over the place in comparison to how they were back in the days when more of them came out? The simple answer is that they're suffering from the same fate as most modern games in the current gaming industry, but in some ways further exacerbated. All the things I've mentioned when critiquing all 7 games are things that often occur in plenty of modern games, like disappointing and lackluster stories, live service elements, rushed development, performance issues. All of these affect modern video games due to how the current climate of video game development is. There are even other problems that affect affect superhero games almost more so than a fair amount of games now. For example, so many superhero games get announced, and then nothing is said for so long, and then all the marketing happens in like the last 6 months before the game comes out. I'm aware a lot of games get this treatment, but it's really common in big budget superhero games, because at least you get more trailers from some of these games. Now, after hearing that answer, you're probably thinking, this video is a giant waste of time, but there is a point to all of this. All of this is to say that a lot of issues with modern game releases are worse here because of the fact that these are popular characters for the most part. Considering that these are giant IPs that are usually destined to make more money than original properties, there's more pressure, and that's how you get rushed releases in the superhero game space. That isn't to say it wouldn't be rushed if these were original characters in an original franchise. In fact, game developers have been rushed even when making games that are about original franchises. However, this is to say that the pressure of the modern game development, along with higher-ups wanting to make money off of these established IPs, contributes to the current state of these games. Now, obviously, if you enjoy any of these games, that's perfectly fine. Even if you enjoy Suicide Squad for some reason, it's not my business nor anyone else's. I'm just mentioning the problems with these games, and I honestly needed a really good excuse to talk about these games in a video, even in some cases, to expand on things I've already said in other videos. While I'm still somewhat excited for the future of these games, I feel weary. What if we get another letdown again, with another character that I've wanted to see in a video game? I won't be too much of a skeptic and say that there's a guarantee that these games will be good or bad, but we've been let down before, and it can definitely happen again. It seems like every superhero game gets announced incredibly early. After that, there's no news for so long before cramming the advertisement in the last few months before the game drops, and it has some disappointing aspect. Even the good games mentioned here have something that goes wrong in some way. Guardians had its poor reception riding off the hate for Avengers. We had Gotham Knights, which had the high expectations of Arkham fans that it lived and died by. Midnight Suns was written off as something that looked generally boring and not what the populace wanted, even if the game was good. Spider-Man 2 had its disappointing story that was a massive step down from the first game. Hellboy was incredibly niche and came out at a time where too many games were coming out, as it was when Spider-Man 2 was coming out anyway. And Suicide Squad was a game that everyone was against from the start of its marketing. Modern superhero games just seem to have some sort of trait that make it feel like a letdown, and that sucks. I'm really hoping all these upcoming games don't suffer from big problems like this, and can do their characters justice in a way that may not be perfect, but at least shoot as high as they aim. I would love for all these characters to be done justice in their own games, so that big superhero games aren't only Batman and Spider-Man. Despite things being a bit murky right now, I still believe that these talented people are competent enough to do these characters right.